My grandson called me late in the night, and the sound of his voice was enough to tell me that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the hour, past midnight, when the world is quiet and only worries stay awake, but the way he said my name, soft and shaken, like he was afraid someone might hear him. I sat up in bed, my heart already racing, the room dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight slipping through the curtains. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd had a bad dream, the kind children still get no matter how old they grow. But my grandson wasn't a child anymore, and the fear in his voice wasn't imaginary. It was the kind that comes from reality hitting too hard, too fast. As he spoke, words tumbling over each other, I listened without interrupting, because years of being a grandmother had taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay quiet and let the truth come out on its own. He told me he didn't know who else to call. That alone hurt more than I expected, because it meant he felt alone in a house full of people who were supposed to protect him. He said he was sitting in his room with the door locked, his phone clutched in his hand, whispering so no one downstairs would hear. I could picture him clearly even though I hadn't seen him in months. The same boy who used to run into my kitchen after school, backpack sliding off one shoulder, asking if I'd made his favorite cookies. Now his voice was older, heavier, carrying a weight no young person should have to bear. He talked about tension in the house, about arguments that never really ended, only paused until the next explosion. He said things had changed slowly at first, so slowly that no one noticed when normal stopped being normal. I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest, the kind that comes when you realize love alone hasn't been enough to keep a family whole. As he spoke, memories rushed back to me. Thanksgivings when everyone sat around the same table pretending everything was fine. Christmas mornings filled with forced smiles and careful conversations. I remembered watching my son, his father, growing more distant over the years, his patience thinner, his words sharper. At the time, I told myself it was stress, work, life wearing him down the way it does to so many people. I never imagined it would spill over onto the next generation. That my grandson would be the one paying the price for problems he didn't create. Hearing him describe the tension, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the way silence felt safer than honesty, made something inside me shift. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a pattern, and patterns don't break on their own. He paused at one point, and I could hear his breathing through the phone, uneven and shallow. I wanted to reach through the receiver, pull him into my arms, tell him everything would be okay the way I used to when he scraped his knee or cried over a broken toy. But this wasn't something I could fix with a hug or a kind word. This was bigger, deeper, and far more complicated. So instead, I told him I was listening, that he wasn't alone, that he did the right thing by calling me. Those words seemed to steady him just enough to keep going. He admitted he felt invisible in his own home, like his feelings were inconveniences everyone else was too busy to deal with. Hearing that broke my heart in a way I wasn't prepared for. When the call finally ended, I didn't go back to sleep. I sat there in the dark, phone still warm in my hand, staring at nothing while my thoughts raced. I replayed his words over and over, looking for signs I might have missed, moments when I could have stepped in sooner. Guilt crept in quietly, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Had I been too polite? Too willing to believe excuses? Too afraid of overstepping? The truth was uncomfortable, but clear. Ignoring problems doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them more time to grow. By the time the first hint of dawn appeared at the edge of the sky, I knew one thing for certain. This call was not just a cry for comfort. It was a turning point. And whether my family liked it or not, things were about to change. By morning, the house was filled with light, but my thoughts were still heavy with everything my grandson had shared during that late-night call. I moved through my routine on autopilot, making tea, straightening the living room, opening the curtains, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every small sound seemed louder, every quiet moment stretched too long. I kept thinking about his words, especially the way he'd said he felt safer talking to me in the dark than speaking freely in his own home during the day. That realization settled deep inside me, stirring a mix of sadness and resolve. I had spent years telling myself that families go through phases, that conflict was just part of growing up and growing older together. But now I saw the truth more clearly. There was a difference between normal disagreements and an environment that slowly crushed someone's sense of security. And my grandson was living in the latter. I decided I wouldn't rush into anything, not yet. Experience had taught me that charging in with accusations only made people defensive and closed off. Instead, I began to observe more carefully. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to conversations that used to fade into the background. I noticed how my son spoke, how frustration seemed to live just beneath the surface of his voice, ready to snap at the smallest inconvenience. I noticed how my grandson moved through the house when I visited, quiet, cautious, always reading the room before he spoke. He wasn't rebellious or rude. He was careful, almost invisible, like someone who'd learned that being noticed came with consequences. That realization hurt more than anything else. No child should feel like shrinking is the safest way to survive. At the same time, I struggled with my own doubts. Part of me wondered if I was overreacting, if I was seeing problems because I wanted to see them. After all, parents and children clash, it's as old as time. But then I remembered the tremor in my grandson's voice. The way he whispered as if the walls themselves might betray him. Fear like that doesn't come from simple disagreements. It comes from living in a constant state of emotional alertness, never knowing when the next outburst might come. I knew then that staying silent would make me complicit. Love doesn't mean avoiding discomfort. Sometimes it means stepping directly into it. I called my grandson later that afternoon, just to check in. He sounded calmer, but tired, like someone who hadn't slept well even after the fear passed. We talked about ordinary things at first, school, friends, the weather, until I gently asked how things felt now. There was a pause before he answered, a hesitation that spoke volumes. He said things were fine, but I could hear the unspoken truth behind the word. Fine meant unchanged. Fine meant surviving, not living. I told him he could always call me, anytime, for any reason. I meant it with every part of me. And as I hung up, I realized this wasn't going to be solved in one conversation or one brave moment. It was going to take patience, honesty, and a willingness to confront truths that had been avoided for far too long. This was only the beginning, and deep down, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. As the days passed, my resolve hardened into something steadier and more deliberate. I didn't announce my concerns or confront anyone outright. Instead, I chose presence. I began visiting more often, not with suspicion in my eyes but with warmth, bringing small excuses. Leftover soup, a book I thought my grandson might like, a need to borrow something I already owned. Each visit gave me a clearer picture of the rhythms inside that house. Tension wasn't constant, but it was predictable, like weather you learn to dress for. There were moments of calm that felt almost peaceful, followed by sudden shifts when impatience flared and voices sharpened. I watched how my grandson responded in those moments. Shoulders tightening, words shrinking, eyes dropping to the floor. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, which made it easier for others to ignore, but to someone who had lived a long life and learned to read what people don't say, it was unmistakable. He was adapting himself to survive emotionally, learning how to disappear without actually leaving. What troubled me most was how normal it all seemed to everyone else. My son would laugh minutes after snapping, acting as though nothing had happened, while the air still felt heavy to anyone paying attention. I recognized that pattern too. How unresolved anger can be brushed aside by pretending it never mattered. It's easier that way, especially for adults who don't want to face the impact of their own behavior. I found myself torn between compassion and frustration. I knew my son carried his own stresses, disappointments, and fears, but I also knew those were explanations, not excuses. Pain doesn't give us permission to pass it on. Watching him interact with his child, I felt a quiet ache settle in my chest, the kind that comes from realizing someone you love is capable of causing harm without intending to. One afternoon, when my grandson and I were alone in the kitchen, I asked him a simple question. What made him feel safe? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he traced a pattern on the table with his finger, thinking carefully, as if the wrong answer might have consequences. Finally, he said he felt safest late at night, when everyone else was asleep and the house was quiet. That answer stayed with me long after I left. A home is supposed to be a place of rest, not a place where safety only exists in silence and darkness. In that moment, I realized that waiting any longer would only teach him the same lesson too many children learn. That adults see the problem but choose comfort over action. I promised myself I wouldn't be another one of those adults. That night, I sat alone with my thoughts, weighing every possible outcome. Speaking up could fracture relationships, bring anger my way, or even push my son further into denial. But staying quiet would cost something far greater. It would cost my grandson the belief that someone saw him, believed him, and was willing to stand beside him. And so, quietly, without drama, I began to prepare for a conversation that could change everything. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold or how it would end, but I knew this much with certainty. Once you truly see fear in a child's eyes, you don't get to unsee it. And once you see it, doing nothing is no longer an option. The conversation didn't happen the way I imagined it would. In my mind, there had been a clear moment, a perfect opening where truth would pour out neatly and everyone would listen. Real life, as it so often does, offered nothing so tidy. Instead, it came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the sky was dull and time seemed to move slowly. I had stopped by unannounced, telling myself it was just another visit, but deep down I knew I was there for a reason. My son was irritated from the moment I walked in. I could sense it in the clipped way he spoke, the way he avoided my eyes. Stress hung off him like a heavy coat he refused to take off. At first, we talked about harmless things, whether work, bills, the small distractions people use to avoid what actually matters. But underneath every sentence, there was tension waiting to break the surface. When my grandson dropped a glass in the kitchen, and it shattered across the floor, the reaction was immediate and sharp. My son's voice rose, not in a scream but in that cold, cutting tone that does more damage than shouting ever could. I saw my grandson flinch, his face draining of color, his hands trembling as he apologized over and over for an accident that could have happened to anyone. Something inside me shifted then. The line between staying polite and staying silent disappeared. I stepped in before my son could say another word. My voice surprised even me, steady, low, and unmistakably firm. I didn't accuse or insult him. I simply said, "That's enough." The room went still. My son stared at me as if he'd never heard me speak that way before, and maybe he hadn't. For years, I had been the one who smoothed things over, who excused behavior by reminding myself he was tired, stressed, overwhelmed. But in that moment, none of those explanations mattered. What mattered was the child standing in front of us, trying to make himself smaller to avoid anger. The argument that followed wasn't explosive, but it was heavy. My son defended himself, listing pressures, responsibilities, everything he carried on his shoulders. I listened, because his struggles were real. But I didn't back down. I told him that stress doesn't give anyone the right to instill fear, that a child shouldn't feel safer in silence than in conversation. Each word felt like stepping onto thin ice, unsure if it would hold. My grandson had slipped quietly out of the room, but I knew he was listening somewhere nearby, absorbing every tone and pause. When the conversation finally ended, nothing was magically fixed. There were no apologies, no emotional breakthrough, no sudden understanding. What there was instead was something quieter, and just as important. A boundary. For the first time, my son understood that his behavior was being seen, and that it wouldn't go unchallenged. As I left that day, my hands were shaking, and doubt crept in. Had I made things worse? Had I pushed too hard? But later that evening, my grandson sent me a short message, just 3 words. "Thank you, Grandma." And in that moment, I knew that whatever consequences came next, speaking up had been the right choice. The days after that visit felt strangely suspended, as if time itself was waiting to see what would happen next. I replayed every word of that afternoon in my head, questioning my tone, my timing, my courage. There is a unique fear that comes with standing up to your own child. A fear that you might lose them, that love might fracture instead of strengthen. I woke up each morning half expecting a call, an angry message, some declaration that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Instead, there was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, uncertain kind that presses against your chest and makes even simple tasks feel harder than they should. During that silence, my grandson reached out more than he ever had before. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't spill his heart all at once. He asked small questions, shared tiny moments from his day, sent pictures of drawings taped to his bedroom wall. Each message felt like a quiet trust being placed in my hands. I realized then that children don't always need grand rescues or loud declarations. Sometimes, what they need most is the steady knowledge that someone sees them and won't look away. That realization came with its own weight of guilt. How long had he been needing that reassurance, and how long had I mistaken silence for peace? One evening, I finally received a message from my son. It was brief, carefully worded, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone trying not to sound defensive while still protecting themselves. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said. He didn't agree with all of it, but he admitted that he might have overreacted at times. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it wasn't dismissal either. I read it several times, recognizing it for what it was. The first crack in a wall that had been built over years. I responded slowly, choosing each word with care, not to win an argument, but to keep a door open. I told him I loved him, that I wasn't his enemy, and that my only concern was the well-being of his child. What followed wasn't immediate change, but gradual awareness. When I visited again weeks later, the atmosphere was different. Not warm, not relaxed, but cautious. My son watched himself more closely. His patience wasn't perfect, but it was present. When my grandson made a mistake, there was a pause where once there had been anger. I noticed it because I was looking for it, because I had learned how much these small moments matter. My grandson noticed it too. I could see it in the way his shoulders didn't tense as quickly, in the way he lingered longer in the room instead of retreating at the first sign of irritation. Still, I knew better than to believe the story was over. Healing doesn't move in straight lines. It circles back, tests old habits, stumbles over familiar triggers. I stayed alert, not in a way that was controlling, but in a way that was attentive. I checked in quietly, asking my grandson how he felt, not just what he did that day. I listened more than I spoke. I resisted the urge to fix everything, understanding that my role wasn't to replace his parents, but to support him where I could. Late one night, my grandson called me again. His voice was calm, but tired, like someone who had been carrying too much for too long. He told me about a small argument, nothing dramatic, but enough to leave him feeling unsettled. I didn't rush to judge or advise. I let him talk, let the silence stretch when he needed it to. When he finished, I told him something simple but true, that his feelings mattered, and that grown-ups are still learning too, even when they pretend they have it all figured out. He laughed softly at that, and the sound stayed with me long after we hung up. That call changed something in me as well. I realized that courage doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like consistency, like showing up again and again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when outcomes are uncertain. I didn't know where this path would lead, whether my son would fully accept what needed to change, or whether setbacks would undo progress, but I knew this. My grandson now knew he wasn't alone. And for a child learning how to navigate the world, that knowledge can be the difference between shrinking inward and standing tall. As weeks turned into months, I began to understand that what we were living through wasn't a single crisis, but a slow, unfolding reckoning. Things looked calmer on the surface, but underneath, emotions were still shifting, settling into new shapes. My son and I spoke more carefully now. Every conversation felt measured, like we were both afraid of stepping on old landmines. There were moments when he seemed softer, more reflective, and moments when the old defensiveness crept back in. I learned not to take either too personally. Change, I reminded myself, is rarely permanent all at once. It comes in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes exhausting. My grandson, however, changed in ways that were easier to see. He laughed more freely when he was with me. He asked questions about my childhood, about mistakes I'd made, about how people learn to forgive without forgetting. Those questions told me more than any confession ever could. They told me he was thinking, processing, trying to understand the adults around him and the world they were shaping for him. I answered honestly, without turning anyone into a villain, but without hiding the truth either. I told him that love doesn't mean never hurting each other, but it does mean taking responsibility when we do. I watched his face closely as I spoke, seeing relief settle in when he realized that confusion wasn't a personal failure. It was a natural response to complicated situations. One afternoon, my son asked if we could talk alone. There was a stiffness to his posture that told me this wasn't going to be easy. He admitted that he felt judged, that my intervention had made him question himself in ways he wasn't prepared for. I listened, even when it hurt, even when I wanted to defend my actions immediately. When he finished, I told him something I hadn't said out loud before, that standing up for my grandson didn't mean I loved my son any less. In fact, it meant I loved him enough to believe he could do better. That idea seemed to stop him. He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at the floor, as if seeing himself through a lens he'd avoided for years. That conversation didn't end with resolution, but it did end with honesty. And honesty, I was learning, is its own form of courage. From then on, I noticed subtle shifts. My son apologized once, briefly, awkwardly, but sincerely, after snapping at his child. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. I saw my grandson's eyes widen at that moment, as if witnessing something rare and fragile. Later, when we were alone, he asked me quietly, "Do grown-ups practice being better like kids do?" I smiled at that, because it was the most insightful question I'd heard in a long time. I told him yes, some do, and some are still learning how. Despite the progress, there were nights when worry kept me awake. I wondered what would happen if I wasn't around, if my voice wasn't there to interrupt moments before they turned into something heavier. That fear was sharp, but it also clarified something important. I couldn't be the solution forever. What I could be was a steady presence, a reminder of what care and accountability look like. I started encouraging my grandson to speak up in small, safe ways, to name his feelings, to ask for space, to trust that his voice mattered. I knew this wouldn't protect him from everything, but it might give him tools he could carry long after my influence faded. One evening, as we sat together watching the sky darken outside my window, my grandson leaned against my shoulder and said he felt lighter lately. That single word filled me with a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that something was improving, sorrow that it had ever been heavy enough for him to notice. In that quiet moment, I understood something deeply. Standing up had changed all of us. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to shift the direction of the story we were living. And sometimes that shift, small, fragile, and hard one, is where real hope begins. There is a point in long, difficult journeys where you stop waiting for a clear ending and start learning how to live inside the uncertainty. That was where I found myself. Life didn't suddenly become peaceful or predictable, but it became more honest. I no longer pretended that love alone fixes everything, and I stopped believing that silence keeps families together. My son and I existed in a careful balance now, still close, still connected, but no longer hiding behind old roles. He was no longer just my child, and I was no longer just the forgiving mother who absorbed everything to keep the surface calm. We were two adults learning, sometimes painfully, how to relate to each other in a healthier way. My grandson continued to grow in confidence, though not in loud or obvious ways. It showed up in how he spoke, how he held eye contact, how he asked questions instead of shrinking away from them. One afternoon, while we were doing homework together at my kitchen table, he told me he had spoken up at school when another child was being teased. He said it casually as if it were no big deal, but I knew exactly what it meant. Children mirror the courage they see. They don't always repeat our words, but they absorb our actions. Hearing that filled me with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with achievement, and everything to do with character. There were setbacks, of course. There always are. There were days when my son slipped back into sharp tones, moments when old habits resurfaced under pressure. But now something different happened afterward. He noticed. Sometimes he corrected himself in the moment. Other times he came back later and acknowledged it. These were small acts, almost invisible to outsiders, but inside a family, they matter more than grand gestures. Each one was proof that awareness had taken root, even if it still needed nurturing. I also had to confront my own regrets. I thought about the years I spent excusing behavior instead of questioning it, about the times I told myself things weren't that bad, because admitting otherwise felt too frightening. That self-reflection was uncomfortable, but necessary. I began to understand that protecting peace at any cost often just delays pain, passing it quietly to the next generation. Accepting that truth didn't make me feel proud, but it made me feel responsible. And responsibility, I was learning, is a form of love too. One night, my grandson asked me if families ever become normal. I asked him what normal meant. He thought for a long moment before saying, "I think it means people don't feel scared to talk." That answer stayed with me. It captured everything I had been trying to protect without fully naming it. I told him that families don't become perfect, but they can become safer, and safety starts with listening. He nodded, as if filing that idea away for later use in his own life. As time passed, I noticed something else changing, my own sense of self. I felt stronger, not because I had confronted someone, but because I had trusted my instincts after years of doubting them. I no longer questioned whether I had done the right thing by speaking up. The fear of losing my son had been real, but so was the cost of staying silent. Choosing courage didn't erase that fear. It simply taught me that fear doesn't get the final say. By then, I understood that this story wasn't about blame or punishment. It was about interruption. Interrupting cycles, habits, and unspoken rules that quietly harm those who are most vulnerable. I didn't know how the next years would unfold. I couldn't guarantee there would be no more conflict, no more hard conversations. But I did know this. My grandson was growing up in a world where at least one adult had shown him that his feelings mattered enough to defend. And sometimes, that single example becomes the foundation on which an entirely different future is built. Looking back now, I understand that the phone call that started everything didn't change my life overnight. It changed the direction of it. Real change is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with applause or dramatic resolutions. It settles in quietly, reshaping daily moments, conversations, and choices. What once felt like a crisis slowly transformed into a turning point. Not because everything became perfect, but because the truth was finally allowed to exist in the open. My relationship with my son never returned to what it used to be, and I no longer wanted it to. The old version was built on avoidance and unspoken compromises. The new one, while sometimes uncomfortable, was grounded in honesty. We talked more now, not just about logistics or surface-level topics, but about boundaries, stress, and the ways we each carried our own emotional weight. Some conversations ended in agreement, others didn't, but none of them ended in silence. That alone felt like progress. The biggest change, though, was in my grandson. He laughed more freely. He disagreed without fear. He asked for help without apologizing first. These weren't dramatic transformations, but they were signs of emotional safety, and emotional safety shapes a child's entire future. Watching him grow into that confidence reminded me why I had spoken up in the first place. Love isn't proven by how much we endure. It's proven by what we're willing to protect. I also learned to release the guilt I had carried for so long. I stopped replaying old moments in my mind, wondering what I should have said or done differently. Regret can be a useful teacher, but it becomes a burden when we let it define us. I chose instead to focus on what was within my control now. Being present, being honest, and being brave when it mattered most. There were moments when I still felt afraid. Fear doesn't disappear just because we act against it once. But each time I chose truth over comfort, that fear lost a little of its power. I discovered that courage isn't about confrontation, it's about consistency. It's about showing up again and again, even when the path forward isn't clear. Today, when I think about that late-night call, I no longer hear panic in my memory. I hear clarity. I hear the moment I stopped convincing myself that silence was kindness. I hear the moment I accepted that love sometimes requires disruption. And I know now that protecting a child's sense of safety is never an overreaction. It's a responsibility. This story doesn't end with a perfect family or a dramatic reunion. It ends with something quieter and far more meaningful. awareness, accountability, and a child who knows that at least one adult will always listen. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this. Change begins the moment we decide that doing nothing is no longer an option.